you for so many of you for coming out. I was just reminded of a time I spoke at the Green Man Festival. Has anyone been to the Green Man Festival in Wales years ago? And I was speaking at night in a packed tent. I was just about to start, and the door opened, and this guy reeled in and shouted, "Bollocks!" really loudly, and then left the room. So hopefully none of you will be moved to shout bollocks at me, but I could hope. So I'm going to be talking about magic mushrooms, and you are the oldest university psychedelic society, so I'm not going to patronise you, but just so that we all know what we're talking about. We're talking about fungi that contain the active ingredient psilocybin and psilocin, its close relative. There's something like 200 species in the world. That total is going up and up as mycologists discover more. There's a big unknown area of Africa where mycologists haven't really explored very much, so I'm sure more mushrooms will be discovered. We've got, as I understand it, 10 species of psilocybin-containing mushrooms in Britain, some of which are cultivated, but the most famous and the most common is the liberty cat, Psilocybe semilanciata, still appearing in a pasture near you right now. This is where I live, on Dartmoor, and by all accounts it's been a bumper harvest. The other group of hallucinogenic fungi, or psychoactive fungi to be precise, are the fly agaric family. Different beast entirely. The fly agaric contains a whole medley of different alkaloids, not all of them particularly pleasant on the body, but the two that people are interested in are ibotenic acid and muscimol. And it has rather different effects and works very differently on the body. I'm not really going to say much about the fly agaric this evening. It's a whole other lecture, but very interesting mushroom in its own right. And the interesting thing about it is that it accrues mythology like no other living organism. Almost all of it untrue and fabricated. How many people here think that Father Christmas is a fly agaric shaman? One or two. It's a lovely idea. Sadly, no evidence for it. It was a story invented by the poet Robert Graves in 1972. We will encounter Robert Graves again. So 10 years ago, I wrote a book, Shroom, A Cultural History of the Magic Mushroom, which has flown off the shelves and made me the wealthy man of leisure you see before you. It's been remaindered and picked up very cheaply in a charity shop. I wrote it because I was fed up of picking up psychedelic literature and reading the same stories over and over again. And it still happens. There's a particular publisher in America, I won't mention who they are, and they publish an awful lot of material, and it seems to be the case that if anyone writes about psychedelics, they feel honour bound to wheel out the history, to mention the big guns, the same stories that we all know and love of Albert Hoffman's psychedelic bicycle ride, Gordon Wasson going to Mexico, Terence McKenna. And I felt that this was achieving the status of mythology. Now, I started off my academic life as an ecologist, and I remember in one of my first lectures being taught never to trust anything published in a book. Always go back to the source evidence because people make mistakes. And that's what I wanted to do with Shroom. I wanted to try and investigate the stories that people were telling about the history of the magic mushroom and see if they were supported by the evidence. Okay, I'm getting ahead of my slides. I feel like there's always a tendency amongst psychedelic enthusiasts to slip into what I call entheogism, to slip into, it's starting to become a religious movement or a new religious movement. And why are we here in this august institution? Because we love critical thinking and we're in theory, we're interested in this subject because it challenges our presuppositions about the nature of reality. So for it to slip into something that is repeated ad nauseam, uncritically, I think that's problematic. I'm going to say more about entheogenism later, but just briefly, it's a term, entheogen, that was coined in 1973 by a group of scholars who were looking for a term. They felt the term psychedelic had become pejorative. It was too associated with hippies, with music, with styles of clothes, with lifestyles. They wanted something that reflected what they thought was the sacred, inherent sacred nature of psychedelic drugs. So they came up with this term that was deliberately meant to mean the experience of God within, or generating the experience of God within. And if you start to tease apart that discourse, already it contains Western Judeo-Christian assumptions about what God means, what a religious experience means, how one should take them in a reverential setting. It contains attitudes of piety, and so on and so forth. I see why they did it. It's not an unproblematic term. And buried within it is the hope that entheogens can somehow save the world or save humanity, to propel us out of rigid ways of thinking into a true vision of the world. So there's a soteriological dimension to this. So to return to this next question of the history of the magic mushroom and the prehistory of the mushroom, this picture is a postcard that I must have picked up at Parsimony many years ago. New Age hill farming, what could they be doing? And it is undoubtedly the case that liberty caps grow in great profusion. It's very easy to find them. And people have argued that they are so ubiquitous that they must have been used in prehistory. But it's so obvious, isn't it? How could people have avoided them? Well, the idea that there was some kind of primitive psychedelic mushroom cult really goes back to two people, two friends, Robert Gordon Wasson at the top, who was an American banker who got very interested in ethnomycology, in this whole question of mushrooms and culture. And the reason why he got interested in it was because he had a Russian wife. He realised that as an American, he was really hostile to the idea of going out and picking edible mushrooms, where she, a Russian, had grown up in a culture where mushroom picking was the norm, and he started to investigate why there were these cultural differences between what he called were mycophobes, people who were frightened of mushrooms, and mycophiles, cultures that loved mushrooms. And he thought the origins lay in a primitive psychedelic mushroom cult. And the difference between the lovers of mushrooms and people who feared them was obviously to do with taboos around who could handle the mushrooms. And I think his ideas were very much fueled by his correspondence with the poet Robert Graves, who was a sort of classic establishment bohemian, if those terms aren't too contradictory. He famously upped sticks, I think in the late 20s, and went and lived in Dea in Mallorca. And there, gradually, over his lifetime, a whole nexus of bohemian thinkers, artists, poets, musicians, gathered around him, and I will have more to say about that later. And Graves famously, he knew an awful lot of stuff, but he never felt beholden to historical fact. So if he felt something was poetically true, then as far as he was concerned, it was true. And he's that kind of patrician figure who with a wave of the hand would say, well, of course the Druids took mushrooms. And it's true because I said so. It has poetic truth. So together they both kind of came up with this idea of an ancient psychedelic mushroom religion. And of course, Robert Gordon Wasson famously in the 1950s travelled to Mexico, which at the time was incredibly difficult to travel to, but it's okay, he was a multi-millionaire banker, so he could go in private jets and organise the visas, and doors opened for him. And he travelled to the then remote region of Oaxaca, where he'd heard a rumour that there were these vision-producing mushrooms. And to cut a long story short, he eventually met an indigenous woman called Maria Sabina, who was an indigenous curandera, or healer. And Wasson became one of the first Westerners to consume hallucinogenic fungi, psilocybin-containing fungi, in an indigenous healing ceremony. And he famously published the story of his encounter in Life magazine and broadcast it to the world and gave the world the name magic mushroom. The title of his article was "In Search of the Magic Mushroom." That's where the term comes from. And Wasson thought he'd struck gold, because here, he thought, was this last living priestess of his ancient mushroom religion. It was inevitably doomed, it was dying, she was the last one. When he took mushrooms with her, he felt like he was seeing the Platonic forms, he felt like he was this disembodied figure, he had a mystical, ecstatic, out-of-body experience, and wrote about it in incredible prose. He's a very, very good writer, a very compelling writer. Yes, and again, just this slide is repeating myself about that this is where these cultural differences in attitudes towards fungi came from. Well, the problem is, as I argue in my book, he completely misrepresented what he found. He was a very good self-publicist. He was a shit anthropologist. He did anthropology Victorian style. His method of anthropology was already very out of date. When I was researching the book, I went to the Wasson archive at Harvard University, which is just phenomenal, and I didn't have nearly enough time to go through it, so I was feverishly going through stuff. And I found this photo of Maria Sabina. Let's just compare it with this one. This was taken by a photographer, Alan Richardson, and there she is in the full bemushroomed ecstasy. This is an iconic image in the literal sense of iconic. It is a religious icon. She is a saint. She's being portrayed and constructed as a saint. There she is, hands to heaven. This is a very different Maria Sabina, who's laying down some fat bossa nova grooves in her home. I don't know where this was taken. Look, she's got a hi-fi. She listens to vinyl. This is a very different kind of person. And of course, she was a Catholic. She identified herself as a Catholic. She didn't identify herself as a priestess of an ancient magic mushroom cult. And the reason why she undertook healing ceremonies with magic mushrooms was for healing, for utilitarian ends. It wasn't designed to give you a mystical experience, or an out-of-body experience, or a direct encounter with Plato's forms. It was to make you better, or to find out if you were going to die. And the mushrooms would tell her what was wrong with someone and how to cure them, or they would tell her that the person was incurable. And I argue that Wasson completely misread what he encountered. Her mushroom ceremonies were syncretic. They blended Catholicism with indigenous worldviews. They were not ancient, they were modern. Context. When talking about psychedelic experience, context is everything. This is a big theme in all my work. But as a result of Wasson mooting this idea of the psychedelic, ancient psychedelic religion, it helped fuel the search for an ancient psychedelia. And books come out all the time arguing that this aspect of prehistory was psychedelic. The rites of Eleusis in ancient Greece, very mysterious mystery religion. No one really knows what happened when you were initiated into the rites of Eleusis. It was very secretive. All we know is that there was some kind of cup called a kykeon, and people came out basically in the ancient Greek equivalent saying, wow, whatever the ancient Greek equivalent of wow was. Some people have argued that Plato's philosophy himself must have stemmed from psychedelic gnosis. How else could he have apprehended those forms? Other people, and again this is too big a subject to go into in this lecture, have argued that the world religions had ancient roots in mushroom cults or psychedelia. Famously, John Allegro in the 70s wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, in which he argued that the origins of Christianity lay in a fly garret cult. And he reached that conclusion, not as I thought because he was insane. I didn't get that wrong in my book, he wasn't nuts. He genuinely believed it, and he reached that conclusion from philology. And then people have argued that mushrooms must have been used in European prehistory, in the Neolithic. What about those Iron Age druids? They must have been up to something with their mistletoe worship and visionary encounters. Didn't we have shamanism too? After all, we've got the mushrooms, which would have been commonplace from the Neolithic onwards. Prior to that, Britain was forested, and the liberty cap would have been pretty rare. And if there was a mushroom that was used in the Paleolithic, it would have had to have been the fly garret, which would have been much more common. It's a forest-dwelling species. Well, the problem with all of these, certainly if we're looking at the history of hallucinogenic fungi, is a complete absence of evidence. There is no evidence. That is the problem. Come back to that. Actually, I won't come back to that. Why do we like the idea that there is this ancient, secret tradition of psychedelia? Why do we like it? Because it addresses our needs now. I was speaking to a friend of mine back in Dartmoor, who's an expert on Neoplatonism and the religion and philosophy of late antiquity. And apparently all these Gnostic cults were appearing in late antiquity, and they all claimed that they had an ancient tradition. The idea that you've got an ancient tradition is ancient. You can say there is a venerable and ancient tradition of inventing venerable and ancient traditions. Humans do it. We like to feel that people have done what we do secretly and it's been oppressed, but hey, that's because we've got the truth, and the man is trying to stop us getting there. So I would say it's intoxicating to feel like we're part of something ancient, secretive, makes us feel good. It justifies and legitimates our practices now, which after all are illegal. Did I forget to say that? Yes, I always do. It's yeah, it seems so bizarre, doesn't it? That possession of any part of a fungus containing psilocybin is a Class A offence with a potential stretch of 7 years in prison. It feeds that feeling of alterity, of otherness. I'm not part of the mainstream. So I'm sympathetic to that need to want an ancient, to be part of an ancient tradition. I have felt it myself. Okay, so there's an absence of evidence in the archaeological record. Why? Well, magic mushrooms don't need any paraphernalia. They don't need syringes, they don't need grinders, they don't need pipes, they don't need snuff tubes or syringes, anything, enema tubes, any of the myriad ways we have devised of getting psychoactives into our body. They don't leave anything hard that would preserve in the archaeological record, unlike the opium poppy, which has been with us since the Neolithic. If you want to look for a venerable and ancient tradition, my friends, it's opium. That's the drug of choice and has been since the Neolithic. We're still using the opiates today. So what people have done is, in this vacuum of evidence, they've tried to look for images of mushrooms that appear in art, in rock art, that kind of thing. And here's the golden rule. Not everything that looks like a mushroom is a mushroom. I'll come on and say more about that in a minute. Not everything that is a mushroom is a magic mushroom. Just because it's a magic mushroom doesn't mean that people were using it intentionally. And just because they were using it intentionally doesn't mean that they were doing it to achieve mystical experience or in an entheogenic way. Here's a road sign in America. I took this photo at the Telluride Mushroom Festival. It looks like a liberty cap. It must mean that there's a secretive magic mushroom cult in America, and these weirdo sign makers are... it's just a road sign, okay? Now, it took my wife, who's an artist, to point this out to me. To us, that looks like a mushroom, right? Yeah? If you were to ask a child to draw a mushroom, they'd probably draw something like that. Those of us in the room who aren't artists or botanical illustrators, if I said draw a mushroom, we'd probably draw something like that. That isn't a mushroom. It looks nothing like a mushroom. Compare it to a real mushroom. That is a culturally agreed sign or symbol that indicates to us mushroom. And to anyone who's been to a festival, they think magic mushroom. It's a sign. Just because something like that appears in history doesn't mean that it means what we think it does. Here's an image. I don't know if people are familiar with this. This is a piece of rock art from Algeria, from the Tassili Plateau, that is much championed in books, in literature, and on the internet. Well, come on, it's a bemushroom shaman, right? In the full bemushroom ecstasy. This picture undoubtedly is of a bemushroom shaman, because it's not the original rock art from Tassili. It's a copy of it drawn by Kat Harrison, who was for a long time Terence McKenna's wife and is a psychedelic writer and thinker in her own right. And therefore her image is very clear and distinct. Again, remember that to us, that says mushroom, it says magic mushroom. I'm sorry, I didn't bring a photo of the original. The original is not so clear. And who knows what these protuberances meant? You can come up with all manner of plausible interpretations of this image. This might be some demonic figure. Is that a bee mask or a wasp mask? Are these somehow representative of venom? It could be a mushroom shaman, it could be a demon, it could be someone's imagination. It doesn't have to mean anything. I've seen what artists doodle. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. So there are all these problems of interpretation, and occasionally people will turn up an image that looks like a mushroom on an Iron Age coin or in a medieval manuscript, and the same problems apply. Without evidence with which we could triangulate that interpretation, it remains purely an interpretation. So, in the UK, there's no archaeological evidence for prehistoric use of magic mushrooms. The earliest historical evidence we have of anyone consuming them is 1799, and then they did so accidentally and they thought they'd been poisoned. I think there are 5 conditions that need to be met for a psychoactive plant to become used. First of all, it has to be available in sufficient quantities. If your magic mushroom only grows in 2 fields and then sporadically once every 5 years, it's very unlikely to slip into popular usage. It has to be easy to identify with no risk of confusing it with something toxic or poisonous. In America, it's possible to confuse psilocybin species with deadly poisonous mushrooms. We don't have that problem here, unless you're very stupid. I have seen some of the mushrooms that people pick, therefore I must conclude that you are all very stupid. So my advice to anyone who is going out picking for the first time is to go with someone who knows what they're picking. Yes, you'd be amazed at how wrong people can be. So I hesitate to say you can't confuse them with something poisonous, because people may. Has to be easy to prepare. If you need a crystal meth lab to produce your drug, that's not going to happen in prehistory, right? It has to have a low toxicity to psychoactivity ratio. Has anyone here ever taken iboga? Not ibogaine, but iboga, the African root bark. Big in Gabon, part of the Bwiti religion. I had the distinct honour and pleasure to take iboga. A friend of mine had been working in Gabon and came back with a bottle of the stuff. And he gave me what the pygmies would consider a child's dose, which was a teaspoon. They give it to their children. It wasn't even a hunter's dose, which is what they take before they go hunting in the forest. Everyone else had a kind of nice, mellow, slightly trippy evening. I couldn't walk for 4 days, and it didn't come down for a month. And I genuinely thought I was going to die. That had a very high toxicity to psychoactivity ratio, and not a plant I would ever want to encounter again. Now, the Liberty Cap meets all 4 of these conditions. But you also therefore need a cultural context in which the experiences occasioned by the plant, by the substance, can be made sense of. Context, remember, is everything. So, here's the thing. People have known about hallucinogenic fungi in England, in Britain, since 1799. And yet the earliest record that I can find, or there may be others, but the earliest record that I can find of someone intentionally taking Liberty Caps is 1970. So what on earth was going on in the 18th and 19th century and early 20th century? We've known about these mushrooms, we've avoided them. I tell you what was going on. We lacked a cultural context in which the experiences occasioned by the mushrooms could be made intelligible. Back then, mycology was not as advanced as it is now. People thought that there were 2 kinds of fungi. There were mushrooms, which were edible, and there were toadstools, which were poisonous. And the art, or the trick, was to distinguish the one from the other. And people came up with all these rules and tests that would supposedly allow you to distinguish one from the other. It was said, for example, that poisonous mushrooms would tarnish a silver spoon, or that they would turn brown if you boiled them up with onion skin. They're all complete bollocks, all these rules. They didn't have proper mushroom classification. So, if you picked a mushroom and something weird something weird started happening, you'd think, oh God, it was a toadstool. Maybe I'm going to die. Not a mindset that is going to afford you a mystical experience, a near-death one perhaps. And here's a lovely cartoon from the Graphic magazine. I think it's from 1830, and it's of a guy, a mushroom collector, who's accidentally eaten some hallucinogenic fungi, and he's seeing strange beasts come out of these mushrooms, and indeed in this sequence his head is turning into some mushrooms. Pretty good for 1830. Actually, this isn't strictly true, what I've just said, because there was a psychedelic discourse of sorts around, and that was to do with laughing gas, nitrous oxide. Humphrey Davy and Coleridge and all that gang at the Bristol Pneumatic Society were inhaling oiled sealskin bags of nitrous oxide and having mystical experiences. And interestingly, Coleridge is the person who gives the Liberty Cap its name, not because of its psychedelic effects, but because of its resemblance to the ancient Roman symbol of liberty, the hat, pointed hat. Now, if Coleridge had got over his innate English distrust of eating mushrooms, maybe the Summer of Love might have happened over many hundreds of years early. It's an interesting thought. What changed? Well, for one thing, mycological classification. Compared to botany, mycological classification happened very late. Gradually, people started rendering out the different species and realizing that there were different species of mushrooms. Also, pharmacology started happening, and Albert Hofmann, the man who discovered LSD, identified psilocybin in the late 1950s. Oh, there it is. Is that making your eyes go weird? Yeah. Okay. The man, I believe, responsible for introducing the knowledge of the magic mushroom to Britain was Robert Graves. He did this, I think, in a number of ways, though there is definitely more than a PhD project for someone here who wants to investigate this more deeply. Because of his friendship with Gordon Wasson, he alerted Wasson to the fact that there were he'd heard this rumour of hallucinogenic fungi in South America, in Mexico. And then when he published his very influential book, The White Goddess, in paperback in 1961, and his paperback version of Good Myths in 1960, so that's slightly wrong. In the new introduction, he wrote about psilocybin mushrooms and his idea of the ancient mushroom cult. Now, Graves was of that kind of standing that the fact he put this information in his introduction to these books meant that people took it seriously. Here was justification. Here was someone who could be trusted, saying that these mushrooms existed and that people had been using them in antiquity for religious reasons. And The White Goddess was widely read by people, by hippies and the psychedelic counterculture. But also there's this Dea-Canterbury connection, without straying into Dr. Matt's territory. Canterbury music scene, living in this amazing city, this extraordinary psychedelic music scene, going back to the 1960s. Well, Robert Wyatt of the Soft Machine, his family were friends with Robert Graves, and Robert Wyatt used to go out to Dea and take all his buddies with him. David Allen of Gong used to go to Dea, in fact lived in Dea, and hung out with Robert Graves. He used to go on Sufi walks with Robert Graves, in which Robert Graves would walk very quickly and fire gnomic questions at David Allen and expect him to answer. Riddling questions like a druidic sage with his students. So it may be that the knowledge of hallucinogenic fungi was imparted directly to one of these musicians in the Canterbury music scene, and that actually this is where it started. So the whole magic mushroom scene in Britain started here in Canterbury. I don't know, it's a really intriguing suggestion, and I really hope someone will do the historical research. And this guy here, up there, is a guy called Lynn Darnton, who in the late 60s, early 70s, formed a group, sort of cult group called the Tribe of the Sacred Mushroom, and they were one of the first groups of hippies in Britain to go and get it together in the country. And Lynn Darnton's account is the first account of an intentional mushroom trip, published in Oz magazine in 1970. He subsequently denied it and has threatened me with legal action, so I probably shouldn't say too much more about Lynn Darnton. Clearly his psychedelic epiphanies have worn off with time, and now he turns his back rather embarrassedly on his hippie past. Well, if you're going to do that, don't leave any evidence in print. Okay, I'm going to fast forward now. I'm sorry, I'm aware I'm going helter-skelter through this. This is a huge subject, and it's very warm in here. So I promise you I won't go on for hours. Though I could. So, If social media is to be believed, we are currently in the grip of a psychedelic renaissance. It's happening right now, and I guess you are part of it. What is the... Did someone go woo? Part of what is going on is some very interesting research on the effects of psychedelics on the brain, and it turns out psilocybin is very useful in this regard. It's useful because it has very low toxicity. Psychologically, it's pretty safe, provided you screen out people who may be susceptible to unfortunate psychological side effects. And it has a short duration compared to LSD. It lasts for 4 to 6 hours rather than 8 or 10 or whatever. Here it is. Here's the molecule. I'm not a chemist, so I just found a slightly cartoony picture of it. The interesting thing about it is that it's very, very similar to serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that exists ordinarily in the human brain. And as I understand it, what it does is it binds to the 5-HTA serotonin receptor. Yeah, this isn't really my area of expertise. How deep shall I go? As I understand it, you've got a neuron, and when a signal comes up the neuron, it needs to jump across the synapse, and the way it does that is by sending a neurotransmitter across. The neurotransmitter is like a key. It goes into the keyhole, its job is done, and it's broken down very quickly. What psilocybin does is it stays bonded, or it's like the key stuck in the lock. Or to use another analogy, it's like a toddler. My daughter went through a phase of pressing doorbells, and she'd ring a doorbell over and over and over again. That's what psilocybin is doing to that 5-HTA receptor. And as I'm sure you all know, if you've been following Robin Carhart-Harris's research, what psilocybin seems to do counterintuitively is it's reducing activity in certain parts of the brain. And one of the most interesting things that's come out of this research, I don't know to what extent Robin is lecturing about this, but he certainly published a brilliant paper, his theory of the entropic brain, and the idea that what is happening when we take psilocybin is that it's increasing entropy in the brain. Let's look at this visually. That's probably easiest. This is a visual representation of possible states of connection within the brain. This is what happens under placebo. This is what happens under psilocybin. And again, I'm straying into areas that I really don't know enough about. But the idea is that psilocybin, or classic psychedelics, they allow more possibilities of connection within the brain. And according to Robin, his theory is that as we move from infancy to old age, our brains, if you like, harden. They become stiff. It becomes less possible for them to exist in different states of connection. Whereas as infants, our brains are very plastic, very labile. We're open to all sorts of possibility. And if you have young children or hung out with young children, their imagination is just extraordinary. They're unlimited by social conventions of reality. They can play in very interesting ways. And the idea is that what psychedelics do is on this spectrum, they push your brain into a state with higher entropy and allow more connections within the brain. I'm not going to go into this. And therefore, there's potential that psilocybin could be treatment for depression or for post-traumatic stress. Very, very interesting research and possibilities going on. This is all great, but I have a few questions to ask the scientists. And it's to do with the problems of mapping brain activity to mental states. Because, as we know, as all the literature has told us since the 1960s, the psychedelic is affected by set and setting. Set is your mental state, your expectations, your mood. Setting is where you do it. If, for example, you have a 30th birthday party and it happens to be raided by a police helicopter and the fire brigade, for example, that's not necessarily a conducive environment to having a pleasant psychedelic experience. A friend tells me. Or another way of putting this is the experience you have is always a product of pharmacology working on an encultured psyche. There's interpretation going on here. Context is everything. So, one of the more famous of the experiments that's happened in the last 10 years has been conducted by Johns Hopkins University. This idea that psilocybin can make you have a mystical experience. They have shown that if you give people placebo and you give them psilocybin in a double-blind, randomized, controlled experiment, people on psilocybin are statistically more likely to have had a mystical experience than on placebo. Woohoo! There are problems with this, I believe. I'm a lone critic. Partly, it's very difficult to get around the problem of that you know when you've had the dose and you know when you've had the placebo. It's kind of obvious when you've got psilocybin and when you've got something that just makes you feel a bit twitchy. That's part of the problem. Another problem was, I think there was a certain amount of experimental suggestion going on. If you look at the photos of where these experiments were held, they were in a very lovely room with a statue of the Buddha and a rose, so no suggestion that you will be having a mystical experience. We in the West, even if all the volunteers in this experiment were psychedelically naive in that they had never taken a psychedelic, but I would argue, given that they were mostly white, college-educated people, they weren't culturally naive about psychedelics. And most people, this is why the term entheogen was coined in the first place, because most people know what psychedelic means, right? It's become just one of those words that people use to signify certain things of garishness or outlandishness, such and such on acid. Everyone knows what that means. It's a phrase we all use. And there is this pre-existing cultural association in the West, since Aldous Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception in the 1950s, that psychedelics have something to do with mystical experience. So if you then are measured, did you have a mystical experience? I would argue you're already culturally conditioned to think that you have had a mystical experience. Then there is the problem of how do you actually measure it, and of course there's this, get this right, there is the Hood mysticism scale that reduces your ineffable experience of timelessness into a 32-point scale and asks questions like, have you experienced the state of timelessness or spacelessness? And then finally, this is very interesting, that science is now straying into a domain of experience that has traditionally been to do with religion. That's not necessarily a problem, but it's interesting. As an ecologist, I drifted into the study of religion. And hermeneutics is a branch of philosophy that actually comes from theology. Hermeneutics is how do we interpret the Bible? How do we interpret the Word of God? Hermeneutics is the art and philosophy of interpretation. And I think the best way of describing hermeneutics is through Monty Python. And the observant of you will know that this picture comes from the life of Brian. And it's that beautiful scene where Brian has just told the multitudes to fuck off. To which the John Cleese character replies, "Tell us, Lord, how shall we fuck off?" And that is a beautiful example of hermeneutics. He needs to interpret this statement, fuck off, but how shall I fuck off? The fundamental problem with psychedelic experience is that it's private. And let's ignore for a moment people who claim to have telepathic experiences on psychedelics. Let's not go there for the time being. Experience is private. The only access I have to your mushroom experiences is if you tell me, if you write it down, if you describe it as a piece of music or a bit of poetry or paint a picture. All of this is a representation of your experience. I do not have access to your experience. All of it is an interpretation. The doors of perception is an interpretation. The Hood mysticism scale is an interpretation, a very radical reduction of something very large that unfolds in duration to 32 questions. And as soon as you get into representation, representation is always culturally bound. We use the language of psychology, ego dissolution. We use the language of mysticism because, whether we like it or not, we've grown up in a Judeo-Christian culture. We know what a mystical experience looks like, even if we haven't had one. In Gabon, when you take iboga in absurdly life-threatening quantities, I mean not life-threatening to me, but life-threatening to your ordinary human being, the idea is not that you have a mystical experience, it's that your soul leaves your body and travels to the realm of the ancestors. Not a question on the Hood mysticism scale. Did your soul travel to the realm of the ancestors? Why would it? It wouldn't occur to us to ask that. That's just what those primitive types mistakenly think. So the whole way we think about psychedelic experience is culturally bound. Context is everything. Here are some representations of psychedelic experience. Soft machine, psychedelic music, just thought I'd throw that in as a local crowd pleaser. Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. I mean, I chose that really for its literary content rather than the cover, but look at the cover. There's the 1950s interpretation of what a psychedelic experience might look like. When I was a student, chaos theory and fractals and the Mandelbrot set were all the rage, and we were like, my God, there it is, there's the psychedelic experience. It looks rather dated now, I have to say. And here's a bit of Huichol art from Mexico, which relates to the peyote experience. Each of these is a cultural representation. The fact that we're even asking the question about psychedelics and mysticism is rooted in a Judeo-Christian discourse. It matters in our culture because mysticism has always been seen as the final proof of religious truth. Forget textual revelation, you can get it direct from the source, and that kind of is meant as a proof of the truth claims of religion. And this is where I come back to this problem with entheogen, is as a discourse it's also bound up in Judeo-Christian notions of sacrality, what constitutes sacred. If entheogens are sacred, does that mean the teenagers on Dartmoor in the town where I live who go out and get mashed on the Saturday night, are they not being sacred? Oh, does it mean you have to take them in a very po-faced, clenched buttock kind of way for it to count as sacred? Probably. Ideas of piety, mysticism and so on. And where I'm coming to with all of this is that inevitably it is the way with discourse and ways of looking at things that certain voices get silenced. And it is always the indigenous voices, the people who in many cases have been using psychoactive substances for many hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, those voices get silenced, marginalised. And I'm a great advocate for us finding out more about what they have to say and truly understanding their worldviews. I thoroughly recommend this book if you haven't read it, Singing to the Plants by Stephen Bayer. It's just one of the best books written about ayahuasca that I've read, and it disabused me of any notion that I understood what shamanism is. When I read it, I realised I still had all these deeply embedded Western assumptions of what shamanism was. And he argues that, certainly in the shamanism he's studying, it has nothing to do with mystery religion, as Wasson was claiming. It's always very utilitarian. The reason why indigenous people take ayahuasca is because they want to get well, or they want to get rid of bad sorcery. Someone's put some mojo on them, and the shaman will get rid of it. visions are often secondary to the purge. It's not the visions that are important. You certainly don't talk about what happened. Again, in the West, what's the first thing we do when we've had a trip? We tell people about it. Hey man, it was wow. You don't talk about it. Why? Because that might invite jealousy, the very thing that invites bad mojo. Context is everything. That's why it's so important when we look to the past, not to just rubber stamp our modern Western assumptions onto the past. People may well have been using magic mushrooms in Britain, but we have no idea what the context was if they were. So, the psychedelic renaissance that we're currently going through, it's this weird kind of thing. At the same time as privileging science, the idea of objective knowledge, that the way to understand psychedelics is by dispassionately looking at how they affect a human brain rather than a person. It privileges materialism, philosophical naturalism, and at the same time it seems to be privileging Judeo-Christian ideas of mysticism. It risks reducing the plurality of psychedelic experiences and context. And I know I was talking to Timmy earlier about the possibility of psychedelic therapy. I'm all for psychedelic therapy. I think it'd be fantastic if psychedelics made their way into psychiatry. But what does it mean for the rest of us? Is this going to be the only legitimate context in which we can take psychedelics? This is Freud's couch, by the way, for those who didn't spot it. What about this? Is that no longer going to, I mean, it's not allowed now anyway, but will it get doubly not allowed if psychedelics get drawn into the medical establishment? I said, I called this talk Magic Mushrooms, Past, Present and Future. So where does this lead us? Where are we going with this? Well, I would certainly like to see psychedelic studies emerge as an academic discipline. And it already is, but I would like to see it more formalised. I would certainly like there to be MAs in psychedelic studies. I think the time is now. University of Canterbury, set that up, maybe. I think it's the interesting thing for me is that psychedelia seems to be engaging in this process of critical self-reflection. So some of these old certainties are starting to be shaken up by critical inquiry. That's what you guys are doing, I hope. And I hope this new this psychedelic renaissance will bridge the sciences and the humanities and not just be led by science. I hope there's an equally important and significant arm coming from the humanities. And I hope it supports a plurality of voices, including indigenous voices, including the teenagers who get mashed on Dartmoor on a Saturday night, because their voices need to be heard too. Their experiences aren't illegitimate. It's very easy to get all po-faced and talk about mushroom entities and Plato's forms and yada yada, and yet what most people do is they go out on Saturday night and they get mashed on mushrooms. That's what they do. And I would like to see this Western worldview, which is there implicitly, get challenged, this psychological Judeo-Christian scientific discourse. Now, to this thorny question that's raised by the whole creation of the term entheogen, can magic mushrooms save the world? Well, this entropic brain theory seems to imply that judicious use of psychedelics can introduce flexibility into human minds. I'm not going to get all political on you, but my God, what a shit year 2016 has been. Not only because some of the great heroes of contemporary music have bowed out, but also Brexit and Trumpageddon, both of which seem to have have been brought about by the older generation, who, if this model is correct, have less flexible minds, that their brains are cognitively less open to newness. I only had to compare my 2-year-old daughter with my 80-year-old mother to see the difference in the flexibility of their minds. And I know which way I'm heading, and I know how to get back to my daughter's side, judicious use of psychedelics. I'm currently writing a new book about mushrooms. It's very different to Shroom. It's really a piece of nature writing, so it's much more writerly. And one of the ideas I'm developing in it is that, at the very least, what we can say about magic mushrooms is that they allow us to play again. Now, this is not to diminish the experiences that they engender. Far from it. If you think that's what I'm saying, that's because play is diminished within Western culture. It's allowable amongst infants. And one of the great delights about being a parent or hanging out with other people's children is the extraordinary ability to which they are able to play. And by that I mean becoming completely engrossed in the game. It's just real. For the duration of the game, it is real. My current very surreal game that I play with my daughter, we have an Indian cushion covered in crazy Indian fabric, and she asked me to put magic from it onto her, which is very surreal, slightly hard to describe, you have to see it. But for the duration of the game, that cushion is magic, and I can transfer magic from it onto her. During the psychedelic experience, whether you think you're having a mystical experience, whether you think you're, it doesn't matter what it is. It's a state of play. You are back into a childlike state in which the game is possible. Might not last into sobriety, doesn't matter. They allow us to play. Now, of course, we play in adult life as well. We have sport, we have politics, we have money. What's money if not some kind of culturally agreed game? It's not that we don't play, but it allows us to play in that childlike way. And, you know, Terence McKenna, who called for an archaic revival, maybe that's part of the makeup too. I'm very nearly at the end. One of the interesting things about magic mushrooms, and I hear this time and time again when I talk to people about their experiences, and I've heard it from university lecturers who lecture in Ecology, and I've heard it from businessmen, and I've heard it from someone who ran a club in London. They say over and over again, magic mushrooms need to be taken or are best consumed outdoors, somewhere wild, away from people, ideally. Because they seem to reveal the world, the other than human world, as sentient, alive, ensouled, having agency. And I've coined the term animaphony, a manifestation of spirits. It seems to me that it doesn't actually matter whether this is genuinely an intrinsic part of the mushroom experience, or whether this is a culturally conditioned discourse to do with our ideas of nature and mushrooms being part of nature. It doesn't matter, because we exist at a time at which anything that draws our attention out of our self-obsessed, narcissistic, social media selves to the other than human persons with whom we share this planet seems to be a very good thing. So it doesn't matter whether it's culturally conditioned or intrinsic to the experience. That seems very important. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.